The telegram in Florence Linden's trembling hands had promised a new life, but nowhere in those carefully printed words was there any mention of a baby. Standing at Willow Creek's dusty train station in the spring of 1878, Florence felt the world spin beneath her feet as she stared at the empty cradle in the corner of the small station office, her future husband nowhere in sight. "Madam, are you quite all right?" The station master's concerned voice seemed to come from a great distance as blackness crept into the edges of Florence's vision. "Madam." The last thing she remembered was the sound of spurs jingling as strong arms caught her before she hit the wooden floor. When Florence awoke, she found herself lying on a narrow cot in what appeared to be the back room of the station. A tall man with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm was leaning over her, his expression a mixture of concern and something else she couldn't quite name. "Welcome back," he said, his voice deep and gentle like distant thunder. "You gave us quite a scare, Miss Linden." Florence struggled to sit up, her hand flying to her disheveled auburn hair. "How do you know my name?" "Vincent Garrison." He tipped his hat slightly. "I'm the man who sent for you." The memories came flooding back: the advertisement in the newspaper, the exchange of letters, the promise of marriage to a stranger in exchange for a fresh start in Montana territory. What hadn't been mentioned was the cradle. "There's a baby," she whispered, her voice catching. Vincent's weather-worn face softened. "That would be Sarah, my sister's little girl." "Your sister's?" Florence repeated, confusion washing over her. Vincent sighed heavily, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. "My sister Eliza died of childbed fever 6 weeks ago. Her husband was killed in a mining accident 2 months before that. Sarah has no one but me now." Florence's hand flew to her mouth. "I'm so sorry. But in your letters, you never mentioned I know." His eyes didn't quite meet hers. "I was afraid you wouldn't come if you knew. Most women want to start fresh, not inherit another woman's child." A mixture of emotions swirled through Florence's: sympathy for this man's loss, anger at the deception, and a strange tenderness for the orphaned baby she hadn't yet met. "Where is she?" Florence asked softly. "Mrs. Peterson from the general store is watching her. I didn't want to bring her to the station in case." Vincent trailed off, but Florence understood. In case she rejected them both upon arrival. "I should like to meet her," Florence said firmly, swinging her legs over the side of the cot despite the lingering dizziness. Vincent looked momentarily taken aback. "You're not upset?" "I am, Mr. Garrison, make no mistake," Florence said as she straightened her travel-worn dress. "But not with the child. Never with the child." For the first time since she'd awoken, Vincent Garrison smiled, and Florence couldn't help but notice how it transformed his solemn face. "Then let's go meet your niece." The general store sat at the center of Willow Creek, a town that consisted of little more than a single dusty street lined with wooden buildings in various states of repair. Florence walked beside Vincent, acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk as they passed. "Your mail order bride," a grizzled old man called out to Vincent from his rocking chair outside the barber shop. Vincent merely nodded, placing a protective hand at the small of Florence's back as he guided her into the general store. The bell above the door tinkled as they entered, and a plump, gray-haired woman looked up from behind the counter. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a faded quilt. "Oh, you're awake, dear," the woman said cheerfully. "I'm Harriet Peterson. Welcome to Willow Creek." Florence barely heard the greeting, her attention fixed on the small pink face peeking out from the blankets. She moved forward as if drawn by an invisible thread. "May I?" she asked, her arms already reaching out. Mrs. Peterson transferred the baby with practiced ease. "She's been an angel, hardly fussed at all. Must know she's meeting her new mama." The word struck Florence like a physical blow. Mama. Is that what she would be to this child? She looked down at the infant's face, rosebud lips, delicate lashes, and a dusting of dark hair that hinted at her relation to Vincent. "Hello, Sarah," Florence whispered, and as if in response, the baby's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises of deep blue that seemed far too knowing for one so young. "She likes you," Vincent said, his voice oddly thick. Florence looked up to find him watching them with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "We've only just met." "Sometimes that's all it takes," he replied, and Florence wasn't sure if he was still talking about the baby. The walk to Vincent's ranch was long, the spring sun warm on Florence's shoulders as they traveled in his wagon. Sarah slept peacefully in a makeshift sling across Florence's chest, seemingly untroubled by the jolts and bumps of the rutted trail. "It's another 3 miles, Vincent said, breaking a silence that had stretched comfortably between them. "Not much to look at yet, but the land's good. Running water year-round, decent grazing for the cattle." Florence nodded, taking in the vast expanse of prairie stretching to the distant mountains. It was beautiful in its wildness, so different from the crowded streets of Boston she'd left behind. "Why did you answer my advertisement?" Vincent asked suddenly. Florence considered her answer carefully. "I suppose for the same reason most women do. Limited options." Vincent's hands tightened on the reins. "Your father didn't approve?" "My father died 2 years ago. Consumption. My mother followed 6 months later." Florence swallowed hard. "There was a man, my father's business partner, who offered marriage, but his intentions were not honorable. So you ran." "I chose a different path," Florence corrected him gently. "One that I hoped might lead to something resembling happiness, or at least peace." Vincent was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I can promise you safety and respect, Miss Linden. The rest, well, that remains to be seen." It wasn't the romantic declaration that the heroines received in the novels Florence secretly adored, but there was an honesty in his words that she appreciated. "Fair enough, Mr. Garrison. And please, call me Florence." "Vincent," he offered in return. "Or Vince, if you prefer." "Vincent," she repeated, liking the way it felt on her tongue. Solid and dependable, like the man himself seemed to be. The ranch came into view as they crested a small, modest cabin with a barn and corral beside it, smoke curling lazily from the stone chimney. It wasn't grand by any means, but Florence could see the care that had gone into its construction, the small garden plot to one side, the neat stack of firewood. "Welcome home," Vincent said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice as he helped her down from the wagon, careful not to disturb the sleeping Sarah. Home. Florence had almost forgotten what that word meant. The cabin's interior was spare but clean, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living space, and 2 small bedrooms off to one side. A handmade cradle sat near the stone hearth, lined with a soft blanket. "I built it for her when Eliza." Vincent's voice faltered. "I hoped it would be enough." Florence gently laid Sarah in the cradle, tucking the blanket around her tiny form. "It's perfect." That first evening set the pattern for the days that followed. They moved around each other cautiously, like dancers learning the steps to an unfamiliar tune. Vincent showed Florence where everything was kept, explained the routine of the ranch, and apologized repeatedly for the simplicity of their accommodations. "I've been sleeping in the barn since I knew you were coming," he explained over a simple supper of beans and cornbread. "The second bedroom is yours. I'll fix it up proper when I can." Florence looked up from feeding Sarah, who had awoken hungry and demanding. "That won't be necessary. I mean, the barn. Surely we can come to some arrangement until—" She trailed off, uncertain how to finish that sentence. Until they were married? Until they knew if this arrangement would work? Vincent's expression was unreadable in the lamplight. "I want you to feel safe here, Florence. We've time enough to sort out the rest." Later, as she settled into the narrow bed in what was now her room, Florence listened to the soft sounds of Vincent moving around in the main room, banking the fire for the night. Sarah slept peacefully in the cradle they'd moved beside her bed, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Florence wasn't naive about what marriage to Vincent would mean. They were strangers still, brought together by circumstance and necessity rather than love. But watching him with Sarah, the tenderness with which he held her, the soft murmur of his voice as he told her stories, Florence felt the first stirrings of something that might, with time and care, grow into affection. The days quickly fell into a rhythm. Florence took over the running of the household, cooking meals, tending to the garden, and caring for Sarah while Vincent worked the ranch. They spoke little during the day, but in the evenings, as they sat by the fire with Sarah sleeping nearby, they began to share pieces of themselves. "I fought for the Union," Vincent told her one night, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "Came west afterward. Couldn't stomach the cities anymore." Florence nodded, understanding more than he realized. The war changed everyone, even those of us who stayed behind. Your brothers? He asked perceptively. Two, she acknowledged. James came home. Thomas didn't. The grief was an old companion now, familiar if not comfortable. Vincent reached across the table, his calloused fingers briefly touching the back of her hand. I'm sorry. The simple contact, the first he'd initiated beyond helping her in and out of the wagon, sent warmth spreading up her arm. Thank you. On the 10th day, as Florence was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, she heard a horse approaching. A woman with honey-blonde hair pulled back and a practical bun rode up on a dappled mare, a basket secured to her saddle. You must be the mail order bride, the woman called as she dismounted with practiced ease. I'm Emma Collins, neighbor from the next valley over. Thought I'd bring some provisions and meet you proper. Florence wiped her hands on her apron, conscious of her disheveled appearance. Florence Linden, it's kind of you to visit. Emma's sharp eyes took in everything: the cabin, the laundry, and finally, Sarah, who was napping in a basket nearby. So the rumors are true. Vince Garrison not only sent for a bride, but has a baby to boot. Florence stiffened at the woman's tone. His niece. Sarah's parents passed recently. Emma's expression softened slightly. Sorry to hear that. Eliza was a sweet girl, if a bit too delicate for frontier life. She handed Florence the basket. Preserves and some dried apple pieces. And news, if you're interested. Florence invited Emma inside, grateful for female company despite the woman's forthright manner. Over coffee, Emma shared the local gossip: who was feuding with whom, which farms were prospering, which families had recently welcomed children. And Vince, how's he treating you? Emma asked, her tone deliberately casual. Florence considered her answer. With respect. Emma's eyebrows rose. That's all. You've been here, what, a week? And sleeping in separate rooms if the talk is accurate. Heat rushed to Florence's cheeks. I don't see how that's anyone's business. It's not, Emma conceded, but folks wonder. Vince has kept to himself since he came back from the war. Never showed interest in settling down until suddenly there's a baby and he's sending off for a wife. She leaned forward. Some think he's the child's real father, not his sister's. Florence's cup clattered against the saucer. That's absurd. Sarah is his niece. Emma shrugged. Just telling you what people are saying. Thought you should know. After Emma left, Florence sat beside Sarah's basket, her mind racing. Could what Emma suggested be true? Could Sarah be Vincent's child, born out of wedlock? It would explain his sudden need for a wife. When Vincent returned that evening, dusty and tired from a day of mending fences, Florence couldn't meet his eyes. Something wrong? He asked, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. Emma Collins visited today, Florence said carefully, watching his reaction. Vincent's expression remained neutral. Did she now? Emma's got a good heart beneath all that talk. She told me what people are saying. About Sarah. His shoulders tensed. And what exactly are they saying? That she's yours. Not your niece, but your daughter. The silence that followed was heavier than any Florence had ever known. Vincent moved to the cradle where Sarah slept, looking down at the infant with an expression so tender it made Florence's heart ache. And if she were, he finally asked, his voice low, would that change things between us? Florence hadn't expected that response. Is she? Vincent turned to face her, his eyes dark with emotion. No, she is exactly who I told you. She is my sister's child. But I would claim her as my own without hesitation if it meant keeping her safe. I promised Eliza I would protect her daughter. Relief washed over Florence, followed quickly by shame for doubting him. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have listened to gossip. It's a small town, Vincent said with a hint of resignation. People talk when they've nothing better to do. Later that night, after they'd eaten and Sarah had been fed and changed, Vincent cleared his throat awkwardly. I was thinking we might ride into town tomorrow. See the preacher. Florence looked up from her mending, her heart suddenly racing. For what purpose? To be married, if you're willing. Vincent's expression was earnest. It's been nearly 2 weeks. You've seen what life here is like: hard work and little comfort. If you want to return east, I'll understand. But if you choose to stay, and if I do, stay I mean, what kind of marriage would it be? Florence asked, needing to know where she stood. Vincent's gaze was steady. One built on mutual respect, I hope. Companionship. A partnership. He paused, a flush creeping up his neck. And in time, perhaps more. It wasn't a declaration of love, but Florence hadn't expected one. What Vincent offered was something rarer: honesty and the possibility of building something meaningful together. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll marry you tomorrow." They were wed in the small white church at the edge of Willow Creek, with Sarah sleeping peacefully in Florence's arms and only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. Vincent had splurged on a new shirt for the occasion, and Florence wore her best dress, a deep blue that matched her eyes. "I, Vincent Thomas Garrison, take thee, Florence Marie Linden, to be my lawful wedded wife," he recited, his voice steady as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, his mother's ring he'd told her that morning. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Vincent hesitated only a moment before leaning down to place a gentle kiss on Florence's lips. It was brief, almost chaste, but Florence felt it like a promise. The journey back to the ranch was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Sarah, as if sensing the significance of the day, was unusually content, making soft cooing sounds as she nestled against Florence's chest. "I had a letter from the bank yesterday," Vincent said as the cabin came into view. "The cattle I ordered from Texas will be here in a month. If the weather holds, we should have a good year." Florence nodded, appreciating his attempt at normal conversation on what was, by any measure, an extraordinary day. "I'll need to put up preserves soon. The wild berries are ripening." This was marriage. She thought the mundane details of life shared between two people who had chosen each other, for better or worse. That night, after Sarah had been settled in her cradle, Florence and Vincent faced each other awkwardly in the main room. "I'll take the barn again tonight," Vincent offered, his expression uncertain. "Give you time to." "No," Florence said quietly. "We're married now. There's no need for that." Vincent's eyes darkened. "Are you sure? I don't want to rush you." Florence took a deep breath, summoning courage she wasn't entirely sure she possessed. "I'm sure." Later, as she lay beside him in the darkness of what was now their bedroom, Sarah's cradle beside the bed, Florence felt a curious mixture of nervousness and peace. Vincent had been gentle, considerate of her inexperience, and now his breathing had evened out in sleep, one arm draped protectively across her waist. This was not how she had imagined her wedding night, as a young girl dreaming of romance. And yet, there was something profoundly right about lying here with Vincent, with baby Sarah sleeping nearby, their strange, new family formed by circumstance but already bound by something deeper. Summer faded into fall, and with the changing season came subtle shifts in the fabric of their life together. Vincent no longer hesitated to touch her, a hand at the small of her back as he passed, fingers briefly tangling with hers as she handed him coffee, a kiss pressed to her forehead before he headed out to work. Small gestures that Florence came to treasure. Sarah grew rapidly, her baby fat giving way to chubby limbs that kicked with increasing strength, her coos transforming into babbling attempts at communication. She had her uncle's, now her father's, dark hair and something of his steady gaze, but her laugh was entirely her own, a bright, bubbling sound that filled the cabin with joy. "She's trying to roll over," Florence called to Vincent one afternoon as he came in from chopping wood. "Come see." Vincent dropped to his knees beside the blanket where Sarah lay on her stomach, making determined efforts to flip onto her back. "Look at you, little one," he murmured, his face alight with pride. "Strong as a mountain lion." Florence watched them, her heart swelling with an emotion she wasn't quite ready to name. This man, who had once been a stranger, now occupied a space in her life that grew more essential with each passing day. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Vincent's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, "about adding on to the cabin. Another bedroom, maybe, for when Sarah's older. Or, Florence prompted when he fell silent. Or for when we have more children. If that's something you want." Florence turned in his arms to face him, though his features were indistinct in the darkness. "You want more children? With you?" "Yes." The simplicity of his answer made her breath catch. "But only if you do." Florence thought of Sarah, of the fierce love that had bloomed in her heart for this child, who shared none of her blood. How much more overwhelming might it be to bear a child of her own? A child with Vincent's eyes or her auburn hair? "I do," she whispered, and felt rather than saw his smile as he pulled her closer. The winter of 1878 was harsh, with blizzards that howled down from the mountains and snowdrifts that nearly buried the smaller outbuildings. They spent the long evenings huddled by the fire, Vincent carving wooden toys for Sarah while Florence read aloud from one of the few books they possessed. It was during one such evening, with the wind rattling the windows and Sarah asleep in her cradle, that Florence realized she had fallen in love with her husband. The knowledge settled over her like a warm blanket, surprising in its rightness. "What is it?" Vincent asked, catching her staring at him. Florence shook her head, suddenly shy. "Nothing. Just thinking." Vincent set aside his carving and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "Share those thoughts." Florence hesitated, unsure how to put into words the complexity of what she felt. "I was just thinking how strange life is. A year ago, I never would have imagined being here, in this place, with you and Sarah." Vincent's hand found hers. "Do you regret it? Coming here?" "No," Florence said firmly. "Not for a moment." Something in her tone made Vincent look at her more closely. "Florence," she took a deep breath. "I love you, Vincent. I didn't expect to, but I do." For a heartbeat, he was perfectly still. Then, with a sound that was half laugh, half sigh, he gathered her into his arms. "Thank God," he murmured against her hair. "I've loved you since the moment you held Sarah in the general store. Didn't want to frighten you by saying it too soon." Florence pulled back to look at him, her eyes filling with tears of happiness. "You're not just saying that." In answer, Vincent kissed her, pouring into the gesture all the love and longing that had been building over the months of their marriage. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Florence Garrison. You and Sarah are everything to me." Spring arrived with the promise of new beginnings. The snow melted, revealing tender shoots of grass in the pastures, and the cattle Vincent had invested in began to multiply. The addition to the cabin was nearly complete, a new bedroom that would be Sarah's when she was old enough to need her own space. One bright May morning, almost exactly a year after Florence had stepped off the train in Willow Creek, she stood at the wash basin, suddenly overcome with dizziness. "Florence." Vincent was at her side instantly, his strong arm supporting her. "What's wrong?" She leaned into him, allowing herself a moment of weakness. I think I'm with child." Vincent's face transformed with wonder. "You're sure?" "Not entirely," Florence admitted. "But it's been 2 months since. And I've been feeling strange. Different." Vincent touched her still flat stomach with reverence. "Our baby." "Our second baby," Florence corrected gently, looking to where Sarah sat on a blanket, now able to stay upright on her own, playing with the wooden horse Vincent had carved for her. "I may not have given birth to her, but she's ours, Vincent. She always has been." Vincent's eyes filled with tears, something Florence had seen only once before on their wedding day. "I didn't know it was possible to be this happy," he said roughly. "When I sent that advertisement, I was desperate. Afraid I couldn't raise Sarah alone. I never imagined I'd find someone like you." Florence brushed her fingers across his cheek. "We found each other, and now we're building something beautiful together." That evening, as the setting sun painted the prairie gold, they sat on the porch of their cabin, Sarah dozing in Florence's arms, Vincent's hand resting protectively over Florence's stomach where their second child grew. "I was thinking," Vincent said softly, "if it's a boy, maybe we could name him Thomas, after your brother." Florence's heart swelled with love for this man who understood, without her having to explain, the importance of honoring those lost. "And if it's a girl?" Vincent smiled, leaning over to press a kiss to her temple. "Something strong, like her mother." Florence leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. The journey that had begun with her fainting beside a cradle in a dusty train station had led her here, to this moment of perfect happiness. "I love you, Vincent Garrison," she whispered. His arm tightened around her shoulders. "And I love you, Florence Garrison, until the day I die and beyond." As the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Florence thought about the strange and wonderful paths life sometimes took. She had come west seeking safety and security, a practical arrangement with a stranger. Instead, she had found a home, a family, and a love deeper than anything she could have imagined. Sarah stirred in her arms, her small face peaceful in sleep, and Vincent's hand remained warm and steady over the new life growing within her. Whatever challenges the frontier might bring, they would face them together, the cowboy, the mail order bride, and the children they would raise with love in the wild heart of Montana.